What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my first impressions for Drakensang, an older CRPG from back in 2009 based on Germany's The Dark Eye ttrpg. And it is one of those CRPGs I've been meaning to get around to for a little bit, mostly just because I love the genre, but this one especially because I'm somewhat unfamiliar with the rule set up until I messed around with this game quite recently to bring you this video before moving to review it in full. And it was definitely a bit of a learning curve on that front, but as with any first impressions video, it's probably best to start where your actual impressions will start, which is to get this game to run. So basically this game is slightly older and it does not like Windows 10 or 11. So if you're playing on Steam, though I would assume GOG probably has this fixed, but for Steam, if you have Windows 10 or 11, the game actually won't start up unless you go to the options for it in Steam and set it to launch in windowed mode. And then once you actually have the game launched, you can set a proper resolution and everything and it'll get sorted out. So as far as getting older games to run, pretty mild stuff, though the only other thing to note, at least in my experience, is that the camera for this game is a little bit awkward, but I don't think it's the actual camera that is at fault. You see occasionally my character just seems to speed up way past what they should be running, and the camera cannot keep up with them, which makes for some really weird camera angles at times, but otherwise it hasn't been too bad. So let's move on to the actual game itself. Right away, this game makes the fact that it's based on a different system pretty readily apparent if you are not familiar with the Dark Eye, with its character creation systems, as you have the option between a bunch of different presets, or you can pick one of these presets and then click on the expert mode button, which will allow you to customize some of their talents and skill allocations, but you can't change their appearance, and it doesn't look like you can change their attributes in character creation at least. Now the thing about these presets though is that it basically forces a race and class combo on you, though that might be for the best in my case because apparently there's like race specific abilities and things for like dwarves and elves. But this does make for an interesting situation where if you're unfamiliar with the game, you can kind of just pick one of these presets that sounds interesting and have a solid place to start. Whereas if you know what you're doing and exactly how you want to build a character, you can click on expert mode and redistribute some of these points available to you, which for myself at least, after about 5 or so hours with the game, I would feel comfortable enough doing now, but certainly not when I was at character creation initially. So why is that? The core of the system here in Drakensang is basically that there are two types of roles: combat roles and talent roles. Combat roles are pretty much what you'd expect. It's a d20 plus your appropriate modifiers against what an enemy will parry or dodge, and you either hit or miss dependent on the attack and, of course, whether or not they parried or dodged it. Now, just about everything else is a little more complicated because this uses your various talents for things like healing wounds, poison, lockpicking, sneaking, even some crafting skills, etc. And every one of those talents rolls 3 attributes represented as a d20 plus your skill modifiers for those things, which is a little confusing at first, which led to some rough moments when I first fired the game up, but I got to grips with pretty quickly. So right away, just to give an example here, I was trying to lockpick with the sort of thief character they give you right away, and I kept failing and I wasn't sure why. Had to do a little bit of digging here, and basically, if you just click on lockpick for a particular chest or anything, it actually tries to assume that you're lockpicking without a tool, which means you take a huge penalty to it. So you actually have to get your lockpicks, or your hairpins as it were, put them on that character's hotbar, and then use those from there to properly lockpick and not take that penalty. But what's more, if you fail at a roll here, you actually get a debuff to it for a short while that also gives you a pretty big penalty, so you have to make sure that if you fail, you wait a second before you try again. Another example is that my literally very first combat fight, I got destroyed by some boars, mostly because they just deal outrageous damage early on, but also because I didn't quite understand how the attack rolls were being made or what I needed to prioritize in terms of weapons and combat maneuvers, as it were, because another portion of the system here is that you can get all sorts of combat abilities and you can even learn to use talents that you don't have, say, proficiency in, for lack of a better term, but you have to find trainers to do so. And if you find the appropriate trainer, they can train you in something you don't know how to do, like, say, pickpocketing. And once you have that base knowledge of how to do the thing, then you can start ranking it up and getting better at it, which also applies to certain abilities that you can use in combat as well as magic, provided your class knows how to use it. So how do you actually upgrade all this stuff? Well, the leveling system in this game is quite different from what you might expect today, though I have seen a similar system in place in just older TTRPGs in general, which is that as you defeat things in combat, clear quest objectives, you'll gain experience that you then spend on either your attributes or your talents or your skills, or a trainer to learn something. Now, when you've gathered enough experience, you will level up, but all leveling up does is simply increase the maximum that you're allowed to bring these talents and things. Now, based on your class and overall setup, individual talents that you start with will be at a certain level, and the higher they are, the better, because then they're actually cheaper to raise farther, which means you'll get more out of it with less of an investment. Now, you can also raise your base attributes this way, but they cost a significant amount more of experience, and the good news is only like 14 to 16 really seems to be necessary anyway. And a lot of these classes or presets seem to, at the very least, start out with about that and what they need, which is where I'd say it seems like they're at least trying to help new players out. So it was definitely a bit of a learning curve, but I'm starting to get my head around it now, again about 5-6 hours in, and I'm doing much better. So let's talk about some other stuff. So story-wise, we receive a letter from an old friend in the town of, I believe it's Freedock, and we're supposed to meet him there, which then unsurprisingly unravels into a big conspiracy involving something to do with some kind of dragon cultist, best I can tell. And I know that turns into some bigger plot, but I would say it gets off to a relatively mellow start as you're running around just doing a few side quests for a town to get permission, basically, to continue on to the city, and then when you get to the city, things start advancing a little more quickly. But as of right now, I'm just now seeing that there is clearly some sort of bigger plot going on, and we have to do some investigating. So let's talk about the actual gameplay of this besides just the rules set. Well, somewhat comically, I would say this reminds me a lot of how Dragon Age Origin plays, albeit a bit simpler in some places. So overall, it's a real-time with pause system. You can pause, give your characters specific orders, and they have a couple of AI presets you can cycle them through, which, by the way, the decision to set those basic default AI packages to passive instead of having them attack your enemies seems a little mean. But that, combined with even things like items or a spell or something like that you'll use to treat injuries that your character can accumulate, it plays very similarly to Origins, which is kind of funny because this game released about a year before Origins did. But mostly I'm just looking forward to messing around with some of the other systems. For instance, I know for a fact you can actually craft a fair bit in this game, such as alchemy or actual blacksmithing. And I just got to the point in the game where they give you a house, which acts as your sort of base of operations for the characters you're not using because your normal party size is 4, but you get more companions than that. And the companions you leave at your base can be trained up to craft for you. And I'm kind of looking forward to messing around with that system, but I am curious if I will lose out on any content there because the game has introduced a few companions that seem to have a decent amount of story associated with them. Such as our initial thief character leaves you once you get decent ways into the game, that is to say to the city, and then you find out he's arrested, and my understanding is I have to go free him to get him back, and he's already embroiled in a huge mess when you find the guy to begin with, so I'm kind of curious how those stories play out. But broadly speaking, for a first impression, so this doesn't go on too long, is that I am having a lot of fun with Drakensang. It does a lot of great things in terms of just its general gameplay and the way it handles quests and whatnot that have been pretty fun to engage with, if a little typical of these types of games, but doing that while also at the same time trying to learn a system I am unfamiliar with has provided a certain level of challenge that the game may not have necessarily intended, but is still fun for me. But I still have some questions around like how good the story winds up being, because it's taken a little while to get where it's going, to be sure. How interesting and fleshed out the companions are, if there's any particularly interesting side quests, that kind of thing. So still a lot to mess around with and form an opinion on, but broadly speaking, I'm enjoying it, and I'm excited to play more of it, which I think is just about as much as you could ask of a first impression. To that end, though, I don't know exactly how long this will take to get a review out for, as this is up against a week of just announcements after announcements, followed by the Steam Next Fest, Plus, I'm trying to do some things around my house in terms of renovation, so there's a lot going on the next week or two. But thankfully, June and July are pretty light as far as new releases go, as long as nothing gets shadow dropped at the announcement shows. So I've got plenty of time to work my way through some older games, with only 1 or 2 new releases coming for the next while, excluding some DLC. But that said, hopefully it won't take too long, and I certainly hope you're looking forward to that review, as I'm looking forward to playing through this game. But in the meantime, do let me know what you think about Drakensang down in the comment section below. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom, and have an amazing day.